The moon was low and pale over the frozen valley, and the light touched the trees with a silver glow, and the air was so cold it seemed to cut through fur and skin, and the predator pack moved like shadows between the tall trunks, with their paws sinking into soft snow, and their breaths coming out in white clouds that faded quickly into the night air, and the forest was silent except for the faint crunch of their movement and the low growl in their empty stomachs. For 3 long nights the pack had hunted across ridges and valleys, and for 3 nights they had found nothing, and the snow had hidden all tracks, and the wind had carried away every scent, and now their strength was fading, and the youngest hunter in the pack was already too weak to walk without stumbling, and the alpha could see the fear in the eyes of the others, and could feel the weight of their hope pressing down on him with every step they took. The alpha was a tall and scarred hunter with fur black as shadow and eyes sharp as ice, and he had led the pack through storms and battles and hunger before, but this time felt different, because the forest seemed empty in a way it had never been before, and even the old trails where prey had always passed were now covered with untouched snow, and no sign of life could be found, and the air smelled of nothing but cold and emptiness. The wind whispered through the trees, and the pack slowed as they reached a clearing where the moonlight fell bright and clear, and the alpha paused to listen, and the others crouched low with ears forward and tails still, because they all felt it at the same time, a strange scent drifting faintly in the cold air, and it was not the scent of prey, and not the scent of rival predators, and not the scent of anything they had ever known before, and it carried warmth and smoke and something sharp and strange that made their hearts quicken. They followed the scent through the trees, moving carefully with silent steps and muscles tense ready for danger, and the scent grew stronger with each breath, until they began to see a faint glow ahead between the trunks of the trees, and it was the glow of fire, and they could hear a faint crackle of burning wood, and the smell of cooked meat was now strong enough to make even the proudest hunter swallow hard in hunger. The alpha gave a signal with a flick of his ear, and the pack spread out, moving in a half circle through the snow, so they could surround whatever had made this fire, and they crept forward until they could see the clearing, and in the center of it there was a small fire built from fallen branches, and above it meat hung on a stick turning slowly over the flames, and the heat shimmered in the air above it, and sitting beside the fire was a creature unlike any they had seen before. The creature had no fur except for the rough coverings it wore over its body, and its face was bare and strange and pale, and its eyes reflected the firelight in a way that seemed almost like the eyes of a predator, yet there was something else in them too, something calm and watching, and the creature sat cross-legged with its hands stretched toward the fire, and in one hand it held a long stick with more meat roasting over the flames, and the smell of it was enough to make the youngest hunter take an involuntary step forward before stopping under the alpha's warning growl. The pack watched from the shadows, their bodies hidden behind the tree trunks, and their eyes fixed on the strange creature, and the fire and the food, and the alpha could feel the pull of hunger against the pull of caution, and he knew the pack was waiting for his choice, and the cold wind brushed over him, carrying that strange warm scent again, and he thought of the empty bellies behind him, and the way their strength was fading with every hour. The creature shifted slightly, and then its head turned, and its eyes looked directly into the darkness where the alpha stood, and the alpha's muscles tensed ready for the burst of movement that would follow if the creature tried to flee. But the creature did not move away, and did not reach for a weapon, and instead it smiled a slow, small smile that seemed out of place in the silent frozen forest, and it lifted the stick of roasting meat, and with a single smooth motion it pulled off a strip of the cooked flesh and tossed it lightly into the snow halfway between itself and the shadow where the alpha waited. The hot meat steamed in the cold air, and the scent was stronger than anything the pack had smelled in days, and the youngest let out a low whine that made the others glance at him, but the alpha kept his eyes on the creature and the fire, and the way the flames made the shadows dance across its strange face, and the alpha felt the moment stretch long and tense like the pause before a leap, and he knew that whatever choice he made now would shape the fate of the pack in the nights to come. And then the human spoke in a voice low and calm, and the words were strange, but the meaning was clear in the tone and the movement of the hands as they gestured toward the fire and toward the forest beyond, an invitation not just to eat, but to follow and learn. And in that frozen clearing under the silver moon the fierce hunters faced something they had never known before, a choice between the old ways and the unknown path that waited ahead. The forest was still and cold, and the wind slid through the trees like a thin blade, carrying the faint smell of the fire and the cooked meat. And the strange creature, who had dared to sit in the heart of the predator's land, and the pack crouched low, their muscles tight, their eyes fixed on the one who had thrown food to them without fear and without the scent of panic that prey always carried. And the Alpha stood in the shadows, his breath slow and controlled, but inside his mind was a storm of questions and caution and hunger. The creature's smile did not falter even as the pack shifted positions in the snow, their paws making no sound, their tails low, their eyes glinting with the reflection of the firelight. And the Alpha took a step forward, his massive frame sliding out from the shelter of the tree shadows, and the flames painted the black of his fur with orange and gold. And the creature's eyes met his without flinching, and the Alpha could see now that the eyes were not the cold, empty eyes of prey, and not the wild, unthinking eyes of beasts, but eyes full of thought and purpose, and something deeper that he could not yet name. The human spoke again, and the words were strange and broken in the air like water over sharp stones, but the tone was slow and careful, and the hands moved in ways that were deliberate, as though shaping the air with meaning. And the Alpha watched the way the human gestured toward the fire and the meat, and then toward the forest beyond, and then mimed the motion of stalking and striking and lifting food to the mouth. And though the sounds meant nothing, the message was clear enough. The human was offering to share food and to share the ways of the hunt. The pack stirred uneasily at this. The idea was as unnatural as the presence of the human itself, for predators hunted alone, or with their own kind, never with strangers, never with prey, never with anything so alien in shape and scent. But the youngest among them kept glancing at the steaming strip of meat lying in the snow between them, and his hunger was written in the tremor of his legs and the faint whine that slipped from his throat. And the Alpha knew the others felt the same, even if their pride and discipline kept them still. The human leaned forward slowly, and with careful motions drew another strip of meat from the fire and tossed it a little closer this time, and the scent rolled over the pack like a wave, rich and heavy with fat and cooked warmth. And the Alpha felt his own hunger twist inside him, but still he did not move. Instead, he stepped forward in measured strides, his paws pressing deep into the snow as he crossed the space between shadow and light, until he stood only a few lengths away from the human and the fire and the meat and the human's strange scent. The human's gaze never wavered, and for a long moment the two simply stood facing one another, one with claws and teeth honed by years of the hunt, and the other with bare hands, but the calmness of a hunter who knew 1,000 other ways to kill and to survive. And slowly the Alpha lowered his head, sniffing at the strip of meat in the snow, and the scent of smoke and strange spices mixed with the rich promise of flesh filled his nose. And without looking away from the human, he took it into his jaws and tasted warmth for the first time in days. A ripple passed through the pack as they saw this, their leader accepting the offering, and the human smiled again, but this time it was not the small, almost secret smile from before, but a wider one that reached the eyes, as if some barrier had been crossed. And the human motioned for the Alpha to watch, and then turned toward the forest, gesturing for the pack to follow. And without waiting for their answer, the human picked up a long stick shaped with a sharp tip and walked into the shadows between the trees, the fire still crackling behind. The Alpha hesitated, but then turned to his pack, and with a flick of his ear gave the signal, and they moved as one, their paws almost silent on the snow, as they followed the strange figure into the deeper dark of the forest. And the human did not look back, yet seemed to know they were there, moving with a pace that was steady but quiet, his eyes scanning the ground and the air as though reading messages hidden in the frost and the bark and the wind. They traveled deeper into the forest, where the snow lay untouched and the air was still, and the only sound was the faint creak of ice high in the branches above. And the human stopped suddenly, crouching low, and motioned for the pack to stay still, and then pointed to a place where the snow bulged slightly, and the Alpha saw only a mound of white. But the human knelt and brushed away the top layer, revealing a narrow hole and a faint warmth rising from it. And with swift hands the human set the stick down and pulled from his side a coil of thin cord, which he shaped into a loop and set over the hole in the snow. The pack watched, puzzled, for this was not the way of their kind. They would have waited for the prey to emerge and then struck in a burst of speed. But the human's method was different, patient and quiet and full of careful preparation. And once the trap was set the human covered the hole again with snow, and placed a few crushed leaves nearby the scent sharp in the cold air, and then motioned for them to move back into the shadows to wait. Minutes stretched into long breaths of silence, and the pack shifted uneasily and used to waiting while prey moved unseen, but then there was a faint twitch of snow near the hole, and in an instant the loop jerked tight, and the snow hair burst upward kicking and twisting, but the cord held, and the human moved with sudden speed, grabbing the animal by the neck, and ending it swiftly before the noise could carry far through the still forest, and the pack's eyes widened, for they had seen many kills, but never one so quick and silent, without a chase, without wasted energy. The human reset the trap, and they moved on, repeating the same act twice more, until they carried 3 fresh hairs slung over the human's shoulder, and the alpha began to see the value in this way, for it left strength in the muscles and meat in the paws, without the long hours of running and chasing, and losing prey to the cold and the shadows. By the time they returned to the clearing, the fire was still glowing with deep red coals, and the human skinned the hairs with hands that moved like water flowing around stone, clean and sure, and soon the scent of cooking meat filled the clearing again, curling into the night air like a promise, and the pack ate, and their bellies warmed, and the cold seemed to fade just a little from their bones. But before the last hair was finished, a sound rolled through the valley, a sound so deep it seemed to rise from the stone beneath the snow, and the pack froze with ears forward and eyes wide, for they knew this call. It was the call of the great snow beast, the monster that no hunter returned from chasing, and it was close, very close. The human's head lifted and his eyes narrowed as if he too understood the danger, and in the silence that followed the call the alpha felt the weight of a new choice pressing down on him, for the human had shown them a new way to hunt, but now they would see if the human could show them a new way to survive against the terror that even the fiercest hunters feared. The roar faded into the frozen air, leaving the forest silent again, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that comes when every creature is holding its breath, and the pack stood tense, their ears shifting for any hint of movement, their eyes searching the darkness beyond the fire, and the alpha could feel their fear, though they did not move, for the sound had come from the mountains, and they knew the snow beast roamed there, but the echo in that call told them it was closer than before. The human's gaze stayed fixed in the direction of the roar, and then, without a word, he reached for the long stick with its sharpened point, and slung the last of the meat into a small sack at his side, and with a motion of his head, he signaled for the pack to follow, and the alpha hesitated for a moment, but something in the human's calm told him this was not a retreat of panic, but a step toward something deliberate, and the alpha gave a short flick of his tail, and the pack moved after him, leaving the fire to burn itself into glowing embers. They moved through the forest in a slow, weaving path, the human's feet pressing the snow in patterns the alpha did not recognize, avoiding the open spaces and hugging the lines of fallen logs and thickets, and the human paused, often bending low to the ground, his hands brushing the snow aside to touch the earth, as if listening to something hidden. And once he stopped to break a branch in a certain way, leaving it angled, just so, at the edge of a tree, and the alpha understood it was a sign or a mark, but for whom he could not tell. The wind carried the smell of ice and stone from the mountains, and beneath it a fainter scent that made the fur along the alpha's spine lift, the scent of the snow beast's territory, a deep animal musk that clung to the cold like shadow to the ground, and the pack was restless, but the human kept his pace steady until they reached a place where the land dipped into a shallow hollow thick with evergreen trees, whose branches hung heavy with snow. Here the human stopped and gestured for the pack to remain still while he knelt at the base of a tree and began to dig into the snow, his hands moving quickly, scooping away the powder until he uncovered a half-frozen stream, the thin line of water trickling dark and cold between icy edges, and the human pointed at the stream and then mimed scooping with his hands and raising them to his mouth, and the alpha understood this was a place to drink, hidden and quiet, where the beast's massive bulk could not easily reach between the trees. After they had drunk, the human moved again, but this time he kept them close, circling the hollow and choosing places where the snow was deep and undisturbed, and here he showed them another trick, bending young saplings low and tying their tips to the ground with loops of cord, placing small bits of meat in the snow beneath and covering them lightly. The alpha saw this was meant for smaller prey, but also sensed a deeper purpose in the human's patience, for each action seemed to be part of a larger pattern invisible to all but him. When the traps were set, the human led them further into the woods to a stand of birch where the snow lay crusted hard over the ground, and here he stopped and began to scrape the bark from one of the trees, filling a small pouch with the dry curls, and the Alpha sniffed at them, catching the faint scent of resin and dry wood, and the human looked at him and mimed striking sparks from stone and flame blooming, and the Alpha understood this was for fire and that the human never traveled without the means to bring warmth into the coldest dark. The day passed in this way, the human moving from place to place, showing them signs in the snow that marked where hares had passed hours earlier, pointing out the faint trails of ground birds, half hidden under low branches, revealing burrows of small animals beneath drifted snow. And each time, he moved with the same careful patience, never rushing, never wasting strength, and the Alpha began to see the shape of this new way of hunting not as a single chase, but as many small acts woven together across the day so that food came steadily, and the body never grew weak from exhaustion. By the time the light began to fade, they had taken 2 hares, and 3 birds from snares, and a half-dozen more from quick strikes the human had guided, and though none were large, the total was enough to fill every belly, and still have some left for the next day. And as the pack ate, the Alpha watched the human carefully, noting the way he placed the remaining meat high in the branches away from scavengers, and how he covered the base of the tree with snow to hide the scent from larger hunters. The forest darkened into night, and the cold deepened, but the human did not seek to return to the clearing with the fire. Instead, he led them to a narrow crevice in a rocky slope, where the wind could not reach, and here he cleared a small space, just big enough for the pack to curl together, and for himself to sit at the mouth, and from the birch shavings, and a spark struck from stone, he built a fire, so small it gave no smoke, yet enough warmth to keep the cold from biting too deep into their bones. The pack rested in shifts, as they always did, but the Alpha noticed that the human seemed to sleep with one eye open, waking at the slightest change in the wind or sound in the forest, and once in the deep night, when the others lay still, the Alpha saw him rise and step into the dark, moving without sound to check the snares they had set earlier, and returning with another hare that he skinned quickly and hung above the fire to dry slowly in the heat away of, keeping it for days to come. Before dawn, the human woke them all with a soft whistle, and they followed him back toward the hollow, where the scent of the snow beast was stronger. Now the human stopped at the edge and crouched low, tracing shapes in the snow with the stick lines and curves that made no sense to the pack, until he placed small stones along the edges and mimed the movement of something large stepping into the space and being forced to turn aside by obstacles, and then he added the motions of spears striking from above, and the Alpha understood this was a plan not for hunting, but for surviving an attack. As the first pale light touched the snow, the wind shifted, and brought with it the heavy musk of the snow beast fresh and close, and the pack froze their ears, tilting toward the sound of branches breaking somewhere beyond the ridge. The human looked at the Alpha, and his eyes held no fear, only a sharp focus, and a readiness that the Alpha had seen only in hunters who had faced death many times, and still chosen to stand. The Alpha gave a single low growl to his pack, and they took positions as the human had shown them, crouched behind fallen logs and low drifts, their bodies hidden, their eyes locked on the path the beast would take. And the human moved to the side, climbing a tree with a rope in his hand, tying it high and hanging a heavy branch over the trail, ready to drop at his signal. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the sound of the beast's approach grew louder, the snow trembling under its weight, and the Alpha felt his heart beating hard in his chest, but he kept still, waiting for the moment to strike. And somewhere above him the human waited too, a silent shadow among the branches, ready to teach them not just how to hunt, but how to stand against the greatest danger their world knew. The sound came first as a deep, slow thud that made the snow tremble with each step, and then the faint snap of frozen branches breaking under great weight, and the pack stayed low, hidden behind the drifts and the fallen logs, their breath tight in their throats, their eyes locked on the narrow path between the trees, where the human's plan would come to life. And the Alpha could smell it now, strong and heavy, the musk of the snow beast rolling through the air like smoke from a great fire, and he felt every muscle in his body ready to spring, yet the human's earlier signal held them still. The wind shifted, carrying a sharp cold gust from the mountain ridge, and in that moment the snow beast appeared, its shape massive and terrible, moving with a slow, relentless power that crushed the snow deep beneath its paws. Its fur was white, streaked with gray, and matted with ice, and its head swung side to side as it tested the air with a nose broad enough to scent prey from far across the valley, and its eyes were small but glowed with a pale light that seemed to burn with an endless hunger, and the alpha felt the weight of its presence pressing against the forest itself. The beast stepped forward into the narrow way between the trees, its huge shoulders scraping against the trunks, and the rope above strained with the weight of the heavy branch the human had set, and the alpha could see the human high above, one arm looped around the trunk, the other gripping the rope, with tense, ready strength, his eyes fixed on the beast, and his body still a stone, waiting for the moment that would matter most. And the pack crouched deeper into the snow, holding the tension like a bow, drawn but not yet loosed. A sudden crack echoed through the forest as the beast's paw broke through a crust of ice, and it slowed, sniffing the air, its gaze sweeping the path ahead. And for a heartbeat the alpha feared it had sensed them all, but the human's sharp whistle cut through the cold air, and at that exact instant he yanked the rope free, the heavy branch swinging down with brutal force, striking the beast's shoulder and unbalancing it in the deep snow. The beast roared, its voice a rolling thunder that shook snow from the branches above, and in that chaos the alpha leapt forward, leading his pack as they swarmed from the sides, striking with claws and teeth, while the human dropped from the tree, spear in hand, landing in the snow with a force that sent powder flying into the air. The beast swung its massive head, snapping at anything within reach, but the narrow path worked against it, forcing it to turn too slowly, giving the pack moments to dart in and out, leaving gashes across its thick hide. The human moved with a speed and purpose the alpha had not seen in any prey creature, his spear driving forward again and again, aiming for the joints where the beast's thick fur thinned, and once striking deep enough to make the beast bellow in rage and pain. The pack pressed the attack, each strike measured to wound without getting trapped under its crushing weight. But the beast was strong, and its fury only grew, and with a violent lunge it smashed its paw into the snow, sending two hunters tumbling through the drifts. The alpha darted in from the other side, biting deep into the beast's leg before leaping back, and the human used that opening to drive his spear upward toward the beast's chest, but the point glanced off thick bone, and the beast reared back with a roar that sent a shock of cold fear through the trees, and in that moment it broke free of the narrow path, charging forward through the deeper snow beyond. The pack gave chase, but the human's sharp command halted them, and the alpha understood the wisdom of it, for to pursue into open ground was to invite death, and instead they regrouped, watching as the beast limped away, its trail marked by splashes of dark blood on the snow, and the human's eyes followed it with the gaze of one who measures distance and direction and remembers every detail, for the time to strike again will come. The human knelt by the two hunters who had been struck, checking their limbs for breaks and their sides for wounds, and though they were shaken they were still able to move, and he gave them a piece of dried meat from his pouch, a gesture the alpha recognized as both aid and encouragement. Then the human stood scanning the forest and gestured toward a slope of rock half hidden by snow and frost. They climbed the slope, finding a shallow cave at its base, and inside the air was still and dry with a floor of frozen earth, and here the human set them to rest while he stepped back out into the forest, collecting branches and strips of bark until he returned with enough to build a small low fire that gave heat without spilling much light into the night. The pack curled close together, their breaths slowly evening as the fire's warmth pushed back the cold. Outside the wind rose, carrying with it the distant echo of the snow beast's roar, a sound that told the alpha this fight was not finished, and as he lay watching the human tend the fire, he began to see the shape of something new forming between them, not the bond of hunter and prey, and not the wary truce of rivals, but the beginning of a shared hunt, a shared survival, and in that thought there was a strange weight of possibility. When dawn came, the human rose first, moving with silent purpose, gathering the snares they had left, and checking the traps near the hollow, each one carrying something to add to their stores, and by the time the pack was ready to move, the human had already divided the food into bundles tied with strips of hide, so each hunter could carry part of a load. And this, too, was strange, for the alpha had never seen a hunt where the burden was shared so evenly and willingly among all. They traveled deeper into the forest, following trails the alpha did not know, and soon the land began to rise again toward the lower slopes of the mountain, where the trees thinned and the wind carried more of the beast's scent. And here the human stopped, showing them with signs where to move and where to hide, as they set more snares, not for small game, but for something larger. and the Alpha realized with a slow understanding that the human intended to face the snow beast again and soon. As the light began to fade, the human led them to a ridge overlooking a frozen pass, and pointed to the far side, where broken trees marked the path the beast had taken in its retreat, and there in the snow they could see the faint red, where its blood had dripped in a long trail leading toward a shadowed cleft in the rock, and the Alpha felt a low growl rise in his chest, for he knew that was where the beast laired, and where their fight would find its end. The human's eyes met his, and in that silent moment an agreement passed between them, the kind that needs no sound and no gesture to be understood. They would hunt together, and they would end this threat, not for food, but for the survival of the pack, and the claim of the forest itself. And as the cold deepened, and the shadows stretched long across the snow, the Alpha knew that the days of hunting, as they once had, were gone, for a new way had begun, and it was bound to the human's strange skill and the courage to stand against what others feared to face. The wind cut across the ridge, carrying with it the heavy scent of the snow beast's trail, and the taste of frost on the air, and the Alpha led the pack down the narrow slope, their paws sinking into the deep snow, while the human moved alongside with his eyes scanning every shadow and every curve of the land. The light was thin and gray, the sun barely a pale glow behind the clouds, and the world felt suspended between night and day as they drew closer to the cleft in the rock where the beast had gone. The path into the pass was broken and uneven, with sharp stones jetting through the snow and patches of ice that glistened in the dim light, and the human paused, often crouching low, to touch the ground or to point at marks half hidden in the drift where the beast had dragged its wounded leg. And the Alpha saw how the human studied each sign, not just seeing, but reading the story it told about the beast's strength and speed, and how far it had gone since the fight in the forest. They reached a place where the trail dipped into a bowl of land surrounded by high rock walls, and here the human raised his hand, and the pack stopped watching as he moved ahead alone to test the ground, and after a moment he turned back and gestured for them to spread out along the ridge above the bowl, their bodies hidden by the drifts, while he began to work at the center, driving the butt of his spear into the snow to mark points, and then digging narrow pits which he lined with sharpened stakes, cut from the broken branches he had gathered earlier. The Alpha understood the trap and signaled for two of the hunters to join him in dragging more branches from the treeline to cover the pits until they looked like solid ground again. The work was slow in the deep snow, and the cold bit into their paws and faces, but the human's movements never faltered, and his eyes never stopped scanning the edges of the bowl, as though he expected the beast to appear at any moment. When the last pit was covered, the human climbed the ridge to stand beside the Alpha, and from this height they could see the mouth of the cleft across the bowl, a dark wound in the stone, from which no sound came, yet the scent of the beast was strong, as if it waited just beyond sight. The Alpha's ears twitched at the faint echo of falling snow somewhere deep in that darkness, and he felt the tension in his chest grow tighter, for he knew that soon the beast would come and the trap would be tested. The human knelt in the snow, and with the tip of his spear drew a quick map, showing the ridge, the pits, and the path the beast would take, and he marked where the pack should strike from above, driving it into the center of the bowl, where the hidden stakes waited, and the Alpha studied the marks until he could see the battle in his mind, the lines of movement, the angles of attack, and the moment when the beast would fall. The air grew still heavy with the weight of the coming fight, and then a deep rumble rolled out from the cleft, the sound of something vast moving through stone and shadow, and the pack tensed as a shape began to form in the darkness. At first only the glint of pale eyes, then the curve of a massive head, and the long sweep of shoulders wider than the mouth of the cave, and the snow beast stepped into the light, its breath steaming in the cold air, its wounds dark against its white fur, and its gaze sweeping the bowl with slow, deliberate focus. The human raised his spear and gave a short, sharp whistle, and the Alpha leapt from the ridge, with his pack pouring down the slope in a wave of fur and claws, their snarls echoing off the stone. The beast roared in answer and charged forward, its paws tearing through the snow as it met their attack, but the narrow space and the slope of the land forced it to move where the human had planned, and in 3 strides its weight crashed down on the first hidden pit, the snow giving way beneath it as the sharpened stakes drove deep into its leg. The beast howled a sound that shook the air like thunder and staggered sideways into the second pit, the trap cutting into its other leg, and slowing its movement the pack swarmed, striking from all sides, while the human came in low, driving his spear again and again into the beast's flanks, aiming for the places where muscle and bone met, and each strike was timed with the pack's attacks, so that the beast could not turn to defend without opening itself to another blow. Blood steamed against the snow, and the beast thrashed its massive body, sending shards of ice and sprays of snow into the air. One swing of its paw smashed a hunter into the ground, and the alpha broke from the attack to pull the injured one clear before leaping back into the fray, his teeth finding the thick muscle of the beast's neck. The human's spear drove in at the same moment, striking deep enough to make the beast's roar turn into a choking bellow. The fight raged through the bowl, the snow churned into red slush under their paws, the human moving with relentless precision, the pack striking in coordinated bursts, each attack driving the beast further into exhaustion. The traps had crippled its strength, but its fury was undimmed, and it fought with the desperation of a creature that knew this was the final battle for its life. At last the human climbed onto the beast's back, using the ridges of bone along its spine for grip, and with both hands he drove the spear down into the base of its skull. The sound of the point breaking through echoed across the bowl, and the beast's roar turned into a long, low shudder as its legs buckled, and it collapsed into the snow, its body shaking once, then going still, the steam from its breath fading into the cold air. Silence fell heavy after the storm of sound, and the pack stood panting, their bodies marked with blood and snow. And the human stepped back from the fallen beast, his breath visible in the air, his eyes meeting the alpha's in a look that carried both exhaustion and triumph. The alpha stepped forward, placing one paw on the beast's neck, and lifting his head to let out a long cry that rolled across the mountains, a call of victory and survival that told every creature in the valley the danger was ended. The human moved to the side, drawing a knife from his belt, and began to work at the beast's hide, cutting away strips of meat that would feed them for many days, and showing the pack how to take only what could be carried without waste. The alpha watched and understood that this too was part of the lesson. The fight was not just about killing the threat, but about making sure every effort, every risk brought something back to keep the pack alive through the cold days ahead. When the work was done and the meat was bundled, the human led them away from the bowl, following a path that curved around the ridge and down toward the shelter of the forest. The air felt different. Now the shadow that had hung over their hunting grounds for so long was gone, and though the cold still bit at their paws and the snow still lay deep, the alpha felt a strength in the pack that had not been there before, and he knew that it had come from more than just the meat or the victory. It had come from learning a new way to face the challenges of the wild, a way that did not rely only on speed or strength, but on planning, patience, and unity. And as the human walked ahead, carrying his share of the weight, the alpha understood that the pack was no longer what it had been. They were something more now, and the forest would remember this day for seasons to come. The forest lay quiet in the wake of the battle, yet beneath that quiet there was a pulse in the air, a deep, steady rhythm like the slow beat of a great heart, and the pack moved in that rhythm now, their paws pressing the snow in time with the weight. They carried their bodies tired, but alive, the meat from the snow beast bundled and slung in hides across their backs, while the human walked ahead, his head turning often to scan the forest as though expecting danger even in the shadow of their victory. The cold air cut deep, but the warmth of survival was strong within them. They followed the ridge, for some time, the land sloping down into a narrow valley, where the trees grew thick and the wind was softer, and here the human stopped, lifting his hand for them to wait. He crouched low and pressed his palm to the snow, feeling the faint tremor beneath it, and the alpha watched, his eyes narrow, as if listening to something far away. Then the human pointed toward a patch of open ground at the edge of the valley, where the snow lay unbroken except for a faint dark stain, and the alpha's nose caught it too, the scent of fresh blood carried on the still air. Moving together, they approached the patch and found the half-eaten remains of a smaller predator, its body torn open and its fur matted with frost, and the alpha recognized the scent of the mountain cats, fierce solitary hunters that rarely strayed this far into the pack's territory. And yet here one had fallen, its killer leaving the carcass to freeze, and the human examined the marks on the snow, the deep claws, the wide spacing of the tracks, and then he looked toward the west, where the clouds were thick and low, and the air carried the faint smell of smoke. The Alpha saw the meaning in his eyes. Without words, another threat was near, and this one walked on two legs like the human, though it did not carry the same scent. There was the sharp tang of iron and ash, and something bitter that spoke of fire and destruction, and the human gestured for the pack to move quickly away from the open ground, leading them deeper into the forest, along winding paths that kept them hidden beneath the boughs of ancient trees, the snow falling softly around them. They came at last to a rise overlooking a small frozen river, and here the human signaled for the pack to stop. He knelt and began to build a small fire. Using the birch shavings and dry twigs, he carried his movements quick and sure, the flame catching with only a few sparks, and the Alpha understood this was not just for warmth, but for preparation. The human was thinking ahead. As always, the battle with the snow beast had been one threat, but the world never gave only one, and already the next was moving toward them. As the fire burned low, the human reached into his pack and drew out pieces of the beast's hide, cutting them into strips and shaping them with careful hands into bindings that he wrapped around the forelegs of the older hunters to give them strength for the travel ahead. He gave smaller pieces to the younger ones to chew on, restoring some energy to their bodies, and the Alpha noted how this act kept them all steady, the fire in their blood still burning from the hunt, but now tempered by the humans' planning. The sound of the frozen river cracked in the cold, the sharp echo carrying far, and the Alpha lifted his head, catching the faint shift of the wind, bringing with it the sound of movement from the west, heavy and deliberate, not the wild rush of prey or predator, but the measured tread of something that moved with purpose. The human heard it too, and rose his eyes, scanning the treeline before looking to the Alpha, and making a quick motion toward the far bank of the river they would need to cross and vanish into the thicker forest before the strangers arrived. The crossing was slow, the ice groaning under their weight, but the human moved first, testing each step before signaling for the others to follow, and the Alpha kept his gaze on the trees behind them, where shadows shifted in the dim light. Though no form yet emerged, once across the river the human led them along a narrow gully that twisted through the land like an old scar, its sides high enough to hide them from sight, and the snow here was deep, muffling their passage. At the end of the gully, they came to another cave, smaller than the one they had used before, but dry and sheltered from the wind, and here the human stopped and began arranging the bundles of meat, stacking them along the wall, where the cold air would keep them from spoiling. He then took a length of cord from his pack and began weaving it between the rocks at the mouth of the cave, leaving just enough space for the pack to slip through, but not enough for anything larger to enter without tearing the lines and making noise. The Alpha lay near the entrance, his eyes on the pale sky beyond the trees, his ears catching every faint shift in the air, and behind him the human moved quietly, checking each of his tools, his spear, his knife, his small bundles of fire-starting materials, every action deliberate, as though he knew the night ahead would demand readiness. The fire from the snow beast fight still burned in his movements, a controlled energy that spoke of a hunter prepared to face whatever would come next. Darkness came early, the clouds heavy with snow, and the wind picking up from the west, carrying again that bitter scent, and now beneath it the Alpha could hear the faint metallic clink of gear, and the low murmur of voices. The strangers were close, their approach slow and cautious, as if they too were hunting, and the Alpha felt the fur along his neck rise. The pack was strong now, their bellies full, their bodies ready, yet this was a new kind of danger, and the human would decide how they would meet it. The human moved to the entrance, crouching beside the Alpha, and together they watched the shadows beyond the trees flicker with movement, shapes shifting in the half-light, until at last figures emerged, their bodies wrapped in furs, their hands carrying long spears tipped with dark metal, their faces hidden behind masks of bone and hide. They moved like those who knew the forest well, but their scent carried no kinship, only the sharp edge of conquest and the hunger for territory. The Alpha's muscles tightened, ready to leap, but the human's hand pressed lightly against his shoulder, a signal to wait and watch. The strangers moved past the mouth of the gully, their eyes scanning the snow, their steps leaving deep prints that the human's gaze followed intently. He was reading them, weighing their skill, their caution, their numbers, and when they had gone he turned back to the Alpha, his eyes hard with decision. Without a sound he began to gather pieces of the beast's hide, shaping them into small bundles with strips of fat wrapped inside. And then he placed them along the edge of the gully, half buried in snow, leaving a faint trail that led away from the cave into a narrow defile Between the rocks, the Alpha understood the intent to draw the strangers away to a place where the land would work against them as the traps had worked against the snow beast. When the last bundle was set, the human returned to the cave, and the pack waited in the darkness, the sound of the strangers growing faint, then stopping, and then the muffled crunch of their steps, turning toward the trail the bait had left. The Alpha listened until the last sound faded into the distance, and then turned his gaze back to the human, who sat by the small fire, his face lit in the flickering glow, the fire in his blood steady and unyielding as he prepared for the moment they would strike. Snow drifted through the forest in slow, swirling patterns carried by the restless wind, and the scent of the strangers still clung to the air, though it was faint now, a ghost of their passing. The pack stirred restlessly inside the cave, their ears twitching at every crack of ice or groan of distant branches. The Alpha lay near the entrance, his body low to the ground, his eyes fixed on the pale light outside, where the shadows moved slowly over the snow, and beside him the human crouched silent, his spear across his knees, his gaze scanning the treeline for the first sign of return. They had waited through most of the night, the fire low, and hidden the bait trail leading far into the defile where the human's traps lay ready. The Alpha did not know what shape those traps took, but he trusted the human's strange skill, for he had seen it turn the snow and the forest itself into weapons. Before outside the wind rose, carrying the faint cry of a bird that should not have been calling at this hour, and the human's head lifted, his eyes narrowing in recognition of the signal. The strangers appeared not from the defile but from the slope to the east, moving in a tight formation, their fur cloaks snapping in the wind, their spears held low, their steps cautious yet determined, and the Alpha understood. They had not been fooled for long. Perhaps they had split their numbers, perhaps the others still followed the bait trail, but these were here, and closing on the cave. The human's hand touched the Alpha's shoulder, a silent message of readiness, and the Alpha gave a low rumble to his pack, the sound like distant thunder rolling across the mountains. The human rose from his crouch, moving to the mouth of the cave, where he pulled from his pack a small bundle of birch shavings and resin wrapped tight in hide. He glanced once at the Alpha, then struck flint to steal the spark, catching instantly the bundle, igniting in a sudden burst of flame and smoke. The human hurled it into the snow at the strangers' feet, the smoke billowing upward thick and bitter in the cold air, and the strangers recoiled, their formation breaking as they coughed and turned their faces away. The Alpha and his pack surged from the cave, like shadows breaking free of the stone, their paws silent over the snow, their eyes bright in the smoke. They struck from the sides and behind, not to kill, but to drive the strangers toward the narrow gully, where the snow was deep and treacherous. The human moved with them, weaving through the fight, his spear striking low to knock legs from under his enemies, each motion measured to create movement, not chaos. The strangers staggered, slipping into the gully, their footing failing under the weight of the snow and the sudden force of the wind that funneled through the gap. The humans signaled sharply, and the pack fell back, melting into the forest shadows. The strangers shouted to one another, their voices sharp with confusion, and the Alpha knew the sound of fear, even when hidden under anger. From above came the sudden crack of breaking ice, as the humans' earlier work revealed itself, snow that had been packed and frozen high along the ridges of the gully walls, now collapsing under its own weight, triggered by the humans' careful cuts and wedges. The white mass fell in heavy sheets, slamming into the gully and burying the strangers in a choking wave of snow and ice. Silence followed, broken only by the faint hiss of settling powder. The Alpha looked to the human, who stood at the ridge, his breath steady, his eyes scanning the scene below to be certain the threat was ended. When he turned back to the pack, there was no triumph in his expression, only the quiet certainty of one who had done what was needed to keep his own alive. They moved together back toward the cave, gathering their supplies and meat, for it was time to leave this place. The human had said with his hands in his eyes that survival meant not just winning, but knowing when to vanish. They traveled for 2 days through the deeper forest, where the snow lay thick over fallen trees, and the only sound was the soft crunch of their paws and the distant call of crows. The human guided them along hidden paths, crossing frozen rivers, at narrow bends, climbing ridges that gave long views of the valleys behind them, always watching for pursuit. But no more strangers came. The Alpha saw how the human marked each turn in the land, storing the knowledge like a map inside his mind and teaching The pack to see these signs to the angle of a broken branch, the shadow of a drift, the faint change in the scent of the air. At night they rested in hollows dug into the snow, or in the shelter of ancient trees, whose roots rose high enough to make a wall against the wind. The human kept the fire small, and hidden their light, no more than a faint glow among the branches, yet the warmth they gave was enough to keep the cold from sinking into their bones. The alpha lay close to the human on those nights, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the calm presence that had become as much a part of the pack as any hunter born to it. On the morning of the third day, they reached the edge of the great forest, where the land opened into rolling plains covered in snow and ice that shone like silver under the pale sun. The wind here was stronger, carrying the scents of distant herds and far-off mountains, and the alpha felt the pull of the open land, yet he also knew it held dangers of its own. The human stopped at the edge, looking out across the vast white expanse, then turned to face the pack, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. With slow, deliberate movements, he showed them how to find water beneath the ice of frozen streams, how to cut strips of meat thin enough to dry quickly in the cold, how to build windbreaks from snow and branches, and how to watch the horizon for the faintest signs of movement. He moved among them, correcting a stance here, adjusting a grip there, passing on each skill with the patience of one who knew these lessons would carry the pack through storms yet to come. When at last they were ready, the human stepped back from the group, and the alpha realized what was happening. The human would not stay, for the plains were not his home. His place was to keep moving, to find those who needed his fire and his knowledge. The alpha felt the weight of that truth, but also the strength it left behind. The pack had changed. They were no longer only hunters, they were survivors of the old forest and the new world beyond it. The human placed his hand on the alpha's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of respect and trust, and in return the alpha touched his head to the human's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat that had led them through hunger and danger and into this moment. Without words they parted the pack, turning toward the horizon, while the human moved back into the forest, his figure fading among the trees until he was gone, leaving only the faint trail of his steps in the snow. The wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of distant prey, and the alpha raised his head, letting out a long call that rolled across the frozen land, a call of strength and survival of the pack that had faced the beast, the strangers, the hunger and the cold, and had learned a way to endure together. They moved forward, their paws sure, their eyes bright with the fire the human had given them, and the forest behind them whispered with the memory of the one who had taught the predators the true art of survival.